Your loyalty is noted. These provisions will see us through the long night ahead.
The smell of burning thatch still clung to Thessaly's hair 3 winters later. She stood now at the edge of the great stone courtyard, wrapped in borrowed furs that hung too loose on her thin frame, watching the Alpha Wolf King accept tributes from visiting chieftains. The palace rose behind him like a mountain of gray stone and dark timber, its towers clawing at the winter sky. Torches blazed along the walls, throwing dancing shadows across the faces of wolves and humans alike, all gathered to witness the season's final ceremony before the snows came. No one noticed her. And Omega was meant to be invisible, after all. That was what the matrons had taught her in the 3 years since they'd found her wandering the ash fields where her village once stood. Keep your eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. Your scent is weak, your presence unremarkable. You exist to serve, nothing more. But Thessaly had not come to serve. She had come because the Alpha Wolf King, Baldrin the Unbroken, whose silver fur gleamed even in his human form, whose golden eyes could freeze a man's heart with a glance, was the one who had given the order. The order that sent his wolf warriors into 12 villages along the southern territories. The order that turned homes into pyres and families into memories. Thessaly's village had been the first. She was 9 years old when she watched from the grain storage pit where her mother had hidden her. Through the slats in the wooden cover, she saw wolves larger than horses tear through the square. She saw her father, the village headman, try to reason with them, his hands raised in peace. She saw the largest wolf, its fur the color of winter moonlight, look at her father with those terrible golden eyes before the others fell upon him. That wolf had been Baldrin. She was certain of it, though she'd been only a child. Those eyes were burned into her memory like a brand. The matrons who found her had brought her to the capital, to the great palace complex where the Wolf King ruled over both his wolf kindred and the human territories they protected. Protected. That was the word they used. As if protection meant villages burned and children orphaned. As if the tribute of grain and livestock the humans paid was for safety rather than survival. In 3 years, Thessaly had learned many things. She'd learned that Omegas, rare and weak as they were, possessed one unique quality. They could move through wolf territories without triggering the territorial instincts of alphas. They could enter places others couldn't. They could get close. She'd learned that the palace stored its winter grain in the eastern tower. That the Wolf King held court in the Great Hall every evening at sunset. That the palace guard changed at midnight, and for 7 minutes, the corridor leading to the king's private chambers was unwatched. She'd learned patience. She'd learned to make herself small and unremarkable. She'd learned to smile at the other servants, to accept their pity for her Omega status, to let them believe she wanted nothing more than a quiet life in service to the palace. And she'd learned that vengeance, like a good blade, must be sharpened slowly. You there? The voice cut through her thoughts. Omega girl. Thessaly turned to find a wolf woman watching her, her auburn hair marking her as one of the king's personal guard. Beta rank, by her bearing. Her eyes were the amber of pine resin, sharp and evaluating. Yes, my lady? Thessaly kept her voice soft, her posture submissive. The ceremony will conclude soon. Ready the king's chambers. Fresh furs on the bed, fire built high. He'll want warmth tonight. The northern scouts report early storms coming. Of course, my lady. Thessaly bowed her head. The wolf woman studied her a moment longer, then turned away, already forgetting the unremarkable Omega servant. They always did. Thessaly moved through the palace like water finding cracks in stone, her feet silent on the cold floors. Other servants rushed past, carrying platters of roasted meat and pitchers of honey wine for the feast that would follow the ceremony. The air smelled of pine smoke and melting tallow, of wet fur and human sweat. The palace was a warren of corridors and stairways, of hidden passages that connected the human servant quarters to the wolf nobility's domains. She knew them all now. The king's chambers occupied the top of the western tower, a circular room with windows that looked out over the territories in every direction. Thessaly had been here a dozen times in recent months, always in service, always invisible. She'd studied every detail. The heavy oak door with its iron bands. The wolf pelts that covered the stone walls. The massive bed carved from northern pine. The writing desk where the king reviewed reports from his territories. The weapons that hung above the fireplace, a great sword, a hunting spear, a bow made from antler and sinew. And the false stone in the wall behind the desk, where she knew he kept the sealed orders. The ones that bore his mark and could command armies. Tonight, she would not build his fire. Tonight, she would take those orders. And tomorrow, when the evidence of his crimes was revealed to the chieftains and elders, when the truth of what he'd done to the southern villages became undeniable, his empire would begin to crack. It was a small beginning. But Thessaly had learned that even the greatest trees could be felled if you knew where to place the axe. She entered the chambers with an armful of split logs, playing her role. The room was cold, the hearth empty. Good. She would need time. She moved to the fireplace and began arranging the wood, her hand steady despite the rabbit's pace of her heart. Through the windows, she could hear the sounds of the ceremony concluding, the ceremonial howls that marked the end of formal proceedings. Soon the feast would begin. The king would drink and hold court for hours. She had time. Thessaly built the fire with practiced efficiency, but she didn't light it. Instead, she moved to the desk. Her fingers found the hidden catch on the stone wall, the one she'd discovered by watching a moonbeam move across the wall and disappear into a crack too straight to be natural. The stone swung inward on a silent pivot. Inside was a leather tube, sealed with wax and marked with the king's personal sigil, a wolf's head crowned with oak leaves. She reached for it. I wondered when you would finally try. The voice came from behind her, soft as snow falling. Thessaly's blood turned to ice in her veins. She turned slowly. Baldrin the Unbroken stood in the doorway of his own chambers, still in his ceremonial furs, those golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her knees weak. He was tall, even for a wolf in human form, his silver hair pulled back to reveal the strong lines of his face. Scars marked his jaw and neck, testament to battles won. He moved with the liquid grace of a predator, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him with a quiet click. You think I don't know every servant who enters my chambers, he said. You think I haven't noticed the little Omega who always volunteers for this duty? Who lingers just a moment too long near my desk? Thessaly's mind raced. Run. Fight. Scream. But her body remained frozen, caught in the gaze of the wolf who had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. I know who you are, Thessaly of Thornhaven, Baldrin continued, moving closer. Daughter of Brennus the headman. Sole survivor of the southern village burnings. I know you were 9 years old when you watched your world end. I know you've spent 3 years working your way into this palace for this exact moment. Her voice, when she found it, came out as a whisper. Then why am I still alive? Because, Baldrin said, stopping an arm's length away, you deserve the truth before you decide whether to be my enemy or my ally. Ally? The word tasted like poison. You murdered my family. My entire village. 11 others after that. You're a monster. Yes, he said simply. I am. But not in the way you think. He reached past her, and she flinched, but he only pulled the leather tube from its hiding place. He broke the seal and pulled out a rolled parchment, yellowed with age. He spread it on the desk, weighing down the corners with stone paperweights shaped like wolves. Read, he commanded. Thessaly's eyes dropped to the parchment, her anger warring with her curiosity. The writing was in an old hand, formal and precise. It was a report, dated 3 months before her village burned. From someone named Corin, captain of the Southern Scouts. Her eyes scanned the words, and with each line, her certainty began to crumble. Disease spreading. Livestock dead within days. Water sources contaminated. Recommend immediate quarantine. Village elders refuse evacuation. Spread to neighboring settlements confirmed. Without intervention, entire southern territory lost within the season. There was a plague, Baldrin said quietly. One that killed wolves and humans alike. It started in Thornhaven, brought by a merchant caravan from across the eastern sea. Your father was a good man, Thessaly. But he was proud. When my scouts warned him, when they begged him to evacuate, he refused. Said it was just a bad flux, that his people wouldn't abandon their homes. You're lying, Thessaly whispered, but the words felt hollow. I wish I were. Baldrin's voice carried something she hadn't expected, grief. By the time the disease spread to 3 more villages, I was out of choices. If I waited, if I tried to force evacuation, the plague would have reached the capital. 20,000 souls lived there, Thessaly. 20,000 against 12 villages of perhaps 200 each. He pulled out another document. This one showed a map, marked with red ink. 12 villages circled. Lines drawn showing spread patterns. I gave the order to burn them, Baldrin continued. To torch every structure, every field that might carry the contagion. And I ordered my wolves to make sure no one fled before the fires were complete. Because anyone who escaped could carry the plague with them. My father, Thessaly said, her voice breaking. He was trying to save his people. He was. And I was trying to save mine. We were both right. We were both wrong. And 3,416 people died because of the choices we made. The number rolled off his tongue with the precision of someone who had counted every single soul. I remember all their names, Thessaly. Every village. Every family. I carry them with me. She looked at him then, really looked. And she saw what she'd been too consumed by hate to notice before. The shadows under his eyes. The way his hand trembled slightly as he rolled up the parchment. The weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders. You're telling me I've spent 3 years hating you for saving lives? No, Baldrin said. I'm telling you that you have every right to hate me for taking them. The plague would have killed them anyway, yes. But I'm the one who gave the order to burn them alive. I'm the one who made that choice. I own it. I will own it until the day I die. Thessaly's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold stone wall. 3 years. 3 years of carefully nurtured rage, of meticulously planned revenge. And now it was ashes, as cold and meaningless as the ruins of her village. Why tell me, she asked. Why not just execute me for treason? Baldrin crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. For the first time, she saw him not as the monster from her nightmares, but as a man carrying more scars than the ones visible on his skin. Because in 2 weeks, the gathering of chieftains begins, he said. Representatives from every territory, wolf and human, will come to the capital. And among them will be 3 who seek to use the village burnings as a rallying cry for war. They'll claim I'm a tyrant, that I murdered innocent humans for sport or territory. They'll demand my head. And if they succeed, this kingdom will tear itself apart. Wolves will turn on humans. Humans will rise up against wolves. The peace we've built over generations will shatter. And you want me to help you? Thessaly almost laughed. The orphan you created? I want you to help prevent another 3,416 deaths, Baldrin said. Because that's how many will die in the first week if civil war comes. And it will be children and elders and innocents, just like before. Just like always. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Thessaly stared at it, that scarred, powerful hand that had signed the death warrant for her village. That had also, apparently, saved 20,000 others. I won't lie to you, Thessaly, Baldrin said. I need your help. The 3 chieftains fomenting rebellion have popular support precisely because of stories like yours. An orphan Omega who suffered under my rule. But if that same orphan were to stand before the gathering and tell them the truth, tell them about the plague, about the choice I faced, it might buy us peace. Or it might get me killed as a traitor to my own people, Thessaly said bitterly. Yes, Baldrin admitted. It might. She took his hand. Let him pull her to her feet. Up close, she could smell him, wolf musk and pine smoke and something else, something that made her Omega instincts stir in ways she'd never felt before. She pushed the feeling away. I need time, she said. Time to think. Time to verify what you've told me. The documents are yours to examine, Baldrin said. All of them. Every scout report, every decision, every name. I'll have them brought to the Omega quarters tonight. Read them all. Decide for yourself what's true. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Thessaly of Thornhaven, I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't find another way. Sorry you had to lose everything. Sorry I had to be the one to take it from you. Sorry doesn't bring them back, Thessaly said. No, Baldrin agreed. It doesn't. Nothing does. He left her there, standing in his chambers with a fire still unlit and a revenge 3 years cold. Thessaly looked down at the documents on his desk, at the careful notations and terrible arithmetic of how to save the most lives when there was no good answer. She thought of her father, who'd refused to abandon his people even when death was coming. She thought of this Wolf King, who'd carried the weight of 3,416 deaths for 3 years and would carry it for the rest of his life. And she thought of the chieftains coming in 2 weeks, ready to start a war that would dwarf the tragedy of a dozen burned villages. Thessaly of Thornhaven had come to the palace to burn an empire. But standing in the growing darkness of the king's chambers, surrounded by the ghosts of choices and consequences, she realized that some fires destroyed what needed to stand. And some fires were lit by people who called themselves righteous while burning the innocent. She needed to know which kind of fire she'd been trying to start. For 2 days, Thessaly didn't sleep. The documents arrived in her quarters that first night, carried by 3 servants and stacked in leather cases that filled half her small room. The other Omegas who shared her space gave her curious looks but didn't ask questions. That was one blessing of being Omega, people assumed you had no secrets worth knowing. If they only knew. She started with the scout reports from Corin, dated 4 months before the burnings. The handwriting was neat, methodical, the observations of someone trained to notice details. First report, unusual number of livestock deaths in Thornhaven. Cattle bleeding from eyes and nose. Sheep found dead in their pens overnight. Village healer unable to identify the illness. Second report, 2 weeks later, 3 human deaths. Similar symptoms. Fever that peaked within hours, bleeding from mucous membranes, violent convulsions. Village elder Brennis, her father's name made her chest tight, has refused offer of assistance from capital healers. Claims his people can handle their own affairs. Third report, disease confirmed in neighboring village of Oakmere. 7 dead. Brenna still refuses evacuation. Has threatened to bar scouts from Thornhaven if interference continues. Thessaly traced her finger over her father's name. She could hear his voice in those words, that stubborn pride that she'd loved and hated in equal measure. He'd been a good headman, fair and just, but he'd also been too proud to admit when he needed help. How many times had her mother argued with him about his stubbornness? She pushed the memory away and kept reading. The reports grew more desperate. Within a month, the disease had spread to 5 villages. Then 8. Then 12. The pattern was clear, traced on maps with meticulous detail. It spread through trade routes, through shared water sources, through families visiting between villages. Corin's final report, dated 1 week before the burning order, was 3 words long. Out of time. The next document was Valdrin's response. She recognized his handwriting now, having seen it on the parchment in his chambers. His script was harder than Corin's, more forceful, but the message was clear. He'd ordered one final evacuation attempt. Offered to send wagons, supplies, guards to escort the villagers to quarantine camps where they could be cared for while the disease ran its course. Her father's response was attached. A single line in his bold hand, "We will not abandon our homes. We will trust in the old gods and our own strength." The old gods. Thessaly remembered the shrine in the village square, the offerings they'd left for protection. Fat lot of good it had done. She found the casualty reports next. Not just from the burnings, but from the disease itself. In the villages that were burned, the death toll before the fires was already catastrophic. In Thornhaven, 70 people had died in the 3 weeks before Valdrin's wolves came. In Oakmere, nearly half the village was gone. The numbers were staggering. But what chilled her blood was the comparison report. A scout had been sent to the eastern kingdoms, to track where the merchant caravan had come from. There, in 3 coastal cities, the same plague had struck. In those cities, where no one had taken action, where the disease had been allowed to spread unchecked, the death tolls were measured in tens of thousands. Entire districts burned after everyone in them was already dead. Bodies piled in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. Thessaly set the report down with shaking hands. She walked to the window of her small room, looking out over the palace grounds. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Servants were already moving through the courtyards, beginning their daily tasks. Life continued, ordinary and precious. How many of these people would have died if the plague had reached the capital? She thought of the Omega children who shared her quarters, orphans like herself who'd been taken in by the palace. Thought of the kitchen staff who always saved her extra bread. Thought of the stable hands who let her visit the horses when she needed to think. Thought of the 20,000 souls who lived in this city, who laughed and loved and fought and dreamed, all unaware of how close death had come to their door. "You look terrible," a voice said behind her. Thessaly turned to find Ianthe, another Omega, standing in the doorway. She was older than Thessaly by perhaps 5 years, with dark hair braided close to her scalp and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been kind to Thessaly when she first arrived, teaching her the palace routines without asking questions about her past. "Couldn't sleep," Thessaly said. "I can see that." Ianthe moved into the room, glancing at the stacks of documents. Word in the servant halls is that the king gave you access to sealed records. There's speculation about what you did to earn that privilege. It's not what you think. I don't think anything, Ianthe said calmly. But I do observe. And what I observe is an Omega who arrived here 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and ghosts in her eyes. An Omega who always volunteered to serve in the king's tower. An Omega who's now reading military reports until dawn. Thessaly met her gaze. If I told you I came here to kill the king, what would you say? I'd say you weren't the first, Ianthe replied without hesitation. And I'd ask if you still wanted to. I don't know, Thessaly admitted. The truth of it sat heavy in her chest. Everything I thought I knew it's more complicated than I believed. Ianthe settled onto the bed, making herself comfortable. The king's history is written in blood and hard choices. But here's what I know. 3 years ago, I was in a village north of here. Different circumstances, same story. Bandits were raiding settlements, killing anyone who resisted. The village elders wanted to pay tribute, to negotiate. The king sent his wolves instead. Killed every bandit in a single night. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn blanket. My brother was one of those bandits. He'd fallen in with bad people, made bad choices. The king's wolves gave him a chance to surrender. He didn't take it. Thessaly's breath caught. I'm sorry. Don't be. He made his choice. But here's the thing, Thessaly. I hated the king for what he did. Hated him with everything in me. But the raids stopped. Other villages were saved. And after a while, I had to ask myself, do I hate him because he was wrong, or because his being right meant my brother was wrong? The question hung in the air between them. The king told me I have a choice, Thessaly said quietly. There's a gathering coming. Chieftains who want to use the village burnings to start a war. He wants me to testify, to tell the gathering about the plague, about why he gave the order. And will you? If I do, I'm betraying everyone who died. Every family that burned. I'm saying their deaths were necessary. And if you don't? Ianthe asked. If you stay silent and let the war come? Thessaly looked back out the window. The sun was higher now, bright and warm despite the winter chill. People were going about their lives, unaware of the decisions being made in dark rooms that would determine whether they lived or died. Just like her village had been unaware, that last morning before the wolves came. He carries their names, she said. All 3,416 of them. He told me he remembers them all. That sounds like punishment enough for any man, Ianthe observed. Even a king. Over the next days, Thessaly continued to read. She found medical reports from healers who'd examined victims of the plague. Found testimony from survivors in the villages that were evacuated early, before the disease took hold. Found letters from families thanking the king for saving them, interspersed with letters from families cursing his name for the loved ones who'd burned. Both were true. Both were real. She found something else too. Evidence that the 3 chieftains planning to use the burnings as a rallying cry had known about the plague. They'd received the same reports as the king. They'd been part of the council that discussed options. And they'd voted to do nothing, to let the disease run its course, because taking action would require admitting that humans and wolves needed each other. Politics. It always came down to politics. On the 3rd day, Thessaly walked through the palace gardens, her mind churning. The gardens were mostly dormant this time of year, but the evergreens provided structure and beauty even in winter. She found a bench near a frozen fountain and sat, watching the ice crystals glitter in the sunlight. "You're making a habit of my quiet places," Baldrin's voice came from behind her. She didn't turn. "Is any place truly quiet for a king?" "No," he admitted, moving around to face her. He was dressed more simply today, in wool and leather rather than ceremony and fur. It made him look younger, though the weight in his eyes remained. "But some places are quieter than others." "I read everything," Thessaly said. "Every report, every letter, every account. I know about the three chieftains. About how they knew and chose politics over lives." "And?" Baldrin asked. "And I hate that you were right," she said fiercely. "I hate that my father's pride killed people. I hate that you had to make that choice. I hate that there was no good answer. I hate all of it." "That's fair," Baldrin said quietly. "But I hate the idea of more children watching their families die even more," Thessaly continued. "So I'll testify. I'll stand before the gathering and tell them what I learned. I'll try to stop this war." Something flickered in Baldrin's golden eyes. Relief, perhaps. Or gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Thessaly said sharply. "This doesn't mean I forgive you. It doesn't mean we're allies or friends. It means I'm choosing the lesser evil, just like you did." "I wouldn't dare ask for forgiveness," Baldrin said. "But I will accept your help, for whatever reason you give it." He started to leave, then paused. "The gathering begins in 10 days. Until then, you're under my protection. There will be attempts to silence you, to ensure you never speak. The three chieftains have resources and few scruples. You'll need to stay close to the palace, close to where my guards can watch over you." "I've survived 3 years planning your death," Thessaly said. "I think I can handle a few political schemers." "Perhaps," Baldrin said. "But indulge me. I've lost enough already. I'd prefer not to lose you too before you have the chance to make a difference." He left her then, disappearing back into the palace's stone corridors. Thessaly sat for a long time in the winter garden, thinking about choices and consequences, about hate and necessity, about the weight of 3,416 names. She thought about her father, stubborn and proud and dead. She thought about this wolf king who carried ghosts like she did, who'd made an impossible choice and lived with the aftermath. She thought about the children in the capital, playing in the courtyards, unaware of how close the knife had come to their throats. And she made peace with her decision. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. But acceptance that sometimes the only choice was which tragedy to prevent, which grief to choose. Thessaly of Thornhaven had come to the palace to burn an empire. Instead, she would try to save one. Not because she wanted to. Not because it would heal her wounds or bring back her dead. But because someone had to choose to stop the burning. And this time, that someone was her. The gathering arrived like winter thunder, swift and overwhelming. They came from every direction, wolf clans from the northern mountains with their thick fur and ice-colored eyes, human settlements from the eastern plains, their wagons loaded with grain offerings, mixed communities from the southern coasts where wolves and humans had lived together for generations, and the western forest tribes, both wolf and human, who painted their faces with sacred clay for the journey. The palace transformed. What had been a place of routine and quiet order became a hive of activity. Tents sprouted in the outer courtyards like mushrooms after rain. Cooking fires blazed day and night. The air filled with a dozen different languages, with the howls of greeting and challenge, with the sounds of old friends reuniting and old enemies sizing each other up. Thessaly watched from the servants' passages, those narrow corridors built into the palace walls that allowed Omegas and staff to move unseen. From here, she could observe everything while remaining invisible. It was a skill she'd honed over 3 years, and now it served a different purpose. She was looking for the 3 chieftains Valdrin had warned her about. The first was easy to spot. Morvain of the western reaches arrived with a contingent of 30 wolves, all battle-scarred and heavily armed. She was a massive woman even in human form, her shoulders broad as a man's, her gray-streaked hair worn in dozens of small braids that clicked with bone beads when she moved. An alpha, powerful and old, who commanded her clan through force of will and fang. The second chieftain was more subtle. Grimwald of the Eastern Plains came dressed as a simple human merchant, his wagon train modest, his retinue small. But Thessaly had read the intelligence reports. Grimwald controlled the grain trade for half the eastern territories. He could starve the capital in a single season if he chose. His power wasn't in teeth or claws but in the simple human need to eat. The third chieftain didn't arrive until the evening before the gathering was to begin. Thessaly was in the kitchens, helping prepare the evening meal, when she heard the commotion. Servants rushed to the windows, and she followed, curious despite herself. A single rider approached the palace. The horse was black as midnight, its coat gleaming in the torchlight. The rider was hooded and cloaked, impossible to identify at this distance. But something about the way they sat, the way they moved, made Thessaly's Omega instinct scream warning. "That's Sereth," one of the older servants whispered, making a sign against evil. "The Shadow Walker." "I thought that was just a story," another servant said nervously. "All stories start somewhere," the first replied. Thessaly had read about Sereth in the intelligence reports. Wolf or human, no one knew for certain. Some said Sereth was both, a hybrid born of forbidden union, walking between worlds and belonging to neither. What was certain was that Sereth controlled the shadow markets, the illegal trades that flourished in the spaces between territories. Weapons, poisons, information. Anything could be bought if you knew where to ask. And Sereth had been in the southern territories when the burnings happened. Had lost profitable operations when those villages burned. The 3 chieftains together represented different kinds of power, military might, economic control, and the shadowy influence of the underworld. Together, they could create a coalition strong enough to challenge Valdrin's rule. Strong enough to tear the kingdom apart. That night, Thessaly was summoned to the king's private study, a smaller room than his chambers, lined with books and maps. Valdrin was there, along with 2 others she recognized from the palace. Torin, the king's advisor, was a wolf with russet fur in his natural form and kind eyes in his human shape. Beside him stood Alira, captain of the palace guard, her warrior scars visible even in the lamplight. "Tomorrow, the gathering begins," Valdrin said without preamble. "Formal proceedings will last 3 days. The 3 chieftains will make their accusations on the 2nd day, as is their right. You'll testify on the 3rd day, after they presented their case." "Why wait?" Thessaly asked. "Why not tell the truth immediately?" "Because we need to know exactly what they're claiming," Torin explained. His voice was measured, thoughtful. "They'll have prepared their accusations carefully. We need to hear them in full before we respond." "There's something else," Alira said, her soldiers' directness cutting through the careful diplomacy. "We've had reports of weapons being moved into some of the visiting camps. Nothing overt, but more than necessary for ceremony or protection." "They're preparing for violence," Thessaly said. It wasn't a question. "We believe so," Valdrin confirmed. "If their accusations gain enough support, they may try to force a challenge. Wolf law allows it." If enough chieftains support a challenge to the king's authority, I must face the accuser in single combat. And if you lose? Then I die, and whoever defeats me becomes king, Baldrin said calmly, as if discussing the weather. And the first act of the new king will likely be to execute anyone who supported me. Including, I'm afraid, an Omega who testified on my behalf. The room fell silent. The crackling of the fire seemed unnaturally loud. You should have led with that, Thessaly said dryly. Despite the tension, Baldrin's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Would it have changed your decision? She thought about it. About the children in the courtyards, about the 20,000 souls in the capital, about the cascade of violence that would follow if the kingdom fractured. No, she admitted. It wouldn't have. Then there was no need to worry you prematurely, Torrens said gently. We have plans in place. Protections. You'll be safe. Until I step into that gathering hall and put a target on my back, Thessaly pointed out. Yes, Alira said bluntly. Until then. Thessaly respected the honesty, at least. What do you need me to do? Over the next hour, they went through the details. Thessaly would be introduced as a witness with personal knowledge of the southern village burnings. She would tell her story, who she was, what she'd lost, how she'd come to the palace. Then she would present the evidence, the documents that showed the plague, the evacuation attempts, the impossible choice. They'll try to discredit you, Torren warned. Say you've been coerced or bribed. That you're under the king's influence, that an Omega can't be trusted to think independently. Let them try, Thessaly said, her voice harder than she felt. I know what I saw. I know what the documents say. And I know that my father's pride killed people just as surely as the king's order did. The words hurt to say out loud, but they were true. She'd carried her father's memory like a sacred flame for 3 years, but the documents had shown her a more complicated truth. He'd been a good man who made a catastrophic mistake. Just like Baldrin. Just like everyone involved in that terrible season. There's one more thing, Baldrin said quietly. The testimony will be public. Once you speak, everyone will know who you are. What you lost. You'll never be invisible again. Thessaly thought about that. 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity, gone in a single moment. The other servants would know. The Omegas in her quarters would know. Everyone would know that she'd been planning revenge, that she'd infiltrated the palace with murder in her heart, and that she'd changed her mind. Some would call her brave. Others would call her traitor. I stopped being invisible the moment I decided to come here, Thessaly said. This just makes it official. After the meeting, Alira escorted Thessaly back to her quarters. The captain moved with a warrior's awareness, her eyes constantly scanning the corridors they passed through. When they reached the Omega wing, Alira paused. You're stronger than you look, she said. It wasn't quite a compliment, more an observation. I've had to be, Thessaly replied. The king respects that, Alira said. He doesn't ask this of you lightly. He knows what it costs. Does he? Thessaly asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. He's the king. He has armies and advisors and the power to burn villages. What does he know about cost? Alira's expression softened slightly. More than you think. Before he was king, Baldrin was the youngest son of the previous ruler. He was never supposed to wear the crown. But plague came then too, different from the one that hit your village, but just as deadly. It killed his father, his 2 older brothers, his mother. Left him alone with a kingdom in chaos and hard choices to make. She paused, her gaze distant. I was there when he gave the order about your villages. I watched him write each name in his personal journal afterward. All 3,416. It took him 3 days. He didn't sleep, didn't eat. Just wrote names until his hand bled and his eyes couldn't focus. He still adds to that journal sometimes, when he learns a name he missed. Thessaly's throat tightened. She didn't want to feel sympathy for the wolf who'd ordered her family's death. Didn't want to see him as anything other than the monster from her nightmares. But the image Alira painted, of a young king writing names until his hand bled, wouldn't leave her mind. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because tomorrow, you'll stand in that hall and defend him, Alira said. And I want you to know that the man you're defending deserves it, even if he doesn't believe that himself. The captain left, and Thessaly entered her quarters to find them empty. The other Omegas were probably at the evening meal or attending to their duties. She was grateful for the solitude. She needed time to think, to prepare herself for what was coming. But solitude didn't last long. A soft knock came at the door. When Thessaly opened it, she found a young wolf standing there, barely more than a boy, his human form showing the awkwardness of someone still learning to control their shape. He wore the colors of Morvaine's Western clan. Message for Thessaly of Thornhaven, he said, holding out a folded piece of parchment sealed with red wax. Warning bells rang in Thessaly's mind, but she took the message. Who sent this? I was just told to deliver it, the boy said, already backing away. I don't ask questions. He disappeared down the corridor before Thessaly could respond. She closed the door and examined the seal. No identifying mark, just plain wax. She broke it carefully and unfolded the parchment. The message was brief: if you value your life, stay silent. The truth serves no one. There are worse things than death for those who betray their own kind. No signature. No clues to who sent it. But the message was clear enough. Thessaly crumpled the parchment and threw it into the small brazier that heated her room. She watched the paper catch fire, curl, and turn to ash. 3 years ago, such a threat might have frightened her. Now it just made her angry. She'd survived her village burning. She'd survived 3 years of grief and rage. She'd survived learning that the world was more complicated than she wanted it to be, that sometimes there were no heroes or villains, just people making impossible choices. She could survive someone threatening her for telling the truth. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Thessaly dressed in her best clothes, a simple gray dress that marked her Omega status but was clean and well-maintained. Ianthe appeared to help her braid her hair, working in silence until Thessaly's brown locks were woven into a practical crown around her head. You don't have to do this, Ianthe said quietly as she worked. Yes, I do, Thessaly replied. People will judge you. Both sides will hate you for not choosing them. I'm choosing the children who deserve to grow up without watching their families burn, Thessaly said. That's enough. Ianthe finished the braid and squeezed Thessaly's shoulder. Then I'll be there. In the hall. So you have at least one friendly face in the crowd. The gesture touched Thessaly more than she expected. She covered Ianthe's hand with her own. Thank you. The gathering hall was ancient, older than the current palace, built from massive stones that predated written history. It could hold 1,000 people, and today it would be full. Thessaly entered through a side door reserved for witnesses and staff, escorted by 2 of Alira's guards. The hall was already filling. Chieftains and representatives took their places on the tiered stone benches that circled the central floor. The lower benches were for visiting delegations, the middle tier for regional leaders, and the highest tier, directly beneath the great windows, for the ruling council. Valdrin's throne sat at the far end, raised on a platform of black stone. It was carved from a single piece of granite, ancient and imposing. The king himself was not yet present. By tradition, he would enter last, after all the delegations were seated. Thessaly was directed to a small alcove near the witness platform, where she could observe but remain separate from the main proceedings. From here, she could see everything. The packed benches, the nervous energy of the crowd, the careful positioning of different factions. She spotted Morvain immediately. The western chieftain sat surrounded by her warriors, her presence dominating her section of the hall. Nearby, Grimwald of the eastern plains sat with deceptive modesty, but Thessaly noticed how many chieftains leaned toward him during conversation, seeking his opinion. Sereth was harder to find. The Shadow Walker had chosen a seat in the middle tier, surrounded by representatives from the border territories, those liminal spaces where law was suggestion more than rule. Even seated, Sereth managed to seem apart from the others, wrapped in dark furs that made features difficult to discern. A horn sounded, deep and resonant. The hall fell silent. Valdrin entered. He wore the full regalia of his station. A cloak of silver wolf fur, a crown of twisted iron and oak, and the great sword of his line strapped to his back. But it was his bearing more than his clothes that commanded the room. He moved with absolute confidence, golden eyes sweeping across the gathered assembly, acknowledging allies and enemies with equal composure. He took his seat on the stone throne, and the gathering officially began. The first day was ceremony and ritual. Traditional greetings, acknowledgement of territories, confirmation of treaties and trade agreements. It was tedious but necessary, the formal framework that allowed sworn enemies to sit in the same room without violence. Thessaly watched it all, memorizing faces, noting alliances. She saw how Morvain's warriors kept their hands near their weapons. How Grimwald smiled and nodded while his eyes calculated. How Sereth remained perfectly still, a shadow given form. And she saw how Valdrin carried himself, the weight of the crown visible in the set of his shoulders, the careful diplomacy of his words. This was a wolf who knew he was walking a knife's edge, who understood that one wrong word could start the war they were all trying to prevent. The first day ended without incident. Thessaly returned to her quarters exhausted despite doing nothing but watching. The tension in the hall had been like a held breath, and she felt drained by the weight of it. She found another message waiting for her, this one slipped under her door. The handwriting was different, more elegant. It read, "There are those who would pay handsomely for your silence. Name your price. Gold, land, safe passage to anywhere you wish to go. You need not be a martyr." Thessaly burned this message too. The second day began with individual petitions. Chieftains brought forward disputes to be judged, trade conflicts to be resolved, territorial disagreements to be mediated. Valdrin listened to each with patience, offering judgments that were fair if not always popular. Thessaly found herself grudgingly impressed by his skill, the way he found compromises that satisfied neither party completely but prevented conflict. Then, as the sun reached its zenith, Morvain stood. "I bring accusation against the king," she said, her voice carrying through the hall like thunder. The room exploded into noise. Shouts, gasps, howls of agreement and denial. Valdrin raised one hand, and slowly, the hall quieted. "State your accusation," he said calmly. Morvain stepped onto the central floor, and Grimwald joined her, followed by Sereth. The three chieftains stood together, a united front. 3 years ago, Morvain began, 12 villages in the southern territories were burned. men, women, children, all burned alive in their homes. Over 3,000 souls murdered on a single night, by order of the king. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some knew this story, but many were hearing it for the first time. The king claims it was necessary, Grimwald continued, his merchant's voice smooth and reasonable. That disease threatened the realm. But where is the evidence? Where are the bodies of the plague victims? All we have are ashes and the king's word. The king's word, Sereth said, and their voice was like silk over steel, neither clearly male nor female, that has always been law. But what value is a king's word when it comes soaked in blood? When the only witnesses are dead, and the only truth is what the king tells us? This is a fair accusation? Valdrin asked the assembled council. By tradition, the ruling council would decide if an accusation had merit before allowing it to proceed. One by one, the council members gave their votes. The count was close, but enough voted in favor. The accusation would stand. Then present your evidence, Valdrin said. What followed was damning. Morvain brought forward testimony from soldiers who'd been part of the burning forces. They spoke of villages put to the torch, of families crying for mercy, of the screams that lasted through the night. Their accounts were vivid, terrible, designed to make the assembly feel the horror of what had happened. Grimwald presented economic analyses showing how the southern villages had been profitable, well managed, no drain on the kingdom's resources. Why would the king destroy such assets unless he had other motives? Perhaps he'd wanted the land for his own purposes. Perhaps the humans there had been too independent, too unwilling to bow to wolf authority. Sereth's testimony was the most insidious. They brought forward whispers and rumors, carefully chosen and presented. Stories of other villages that had questioned the king's rule and later suffered mysterious accidents. Of chieftains who'd opposed Valdrin and later lost their positions. Of a pattern of power consolidated through fear and violence. None of it was outright false, but all of it was twisted, context removed, presented in the worst possible light. And through it all, Valdrin sat silent on his throne, listening to himself be painted as a tyrant and murderer. When the three chieftains finished, the hall was seething. Thessaly could feel the mood shifting, anger building like storm clouds. Many in the crowd had been sympathetic to Valdrin, but the testimony had shaken that support. Three chieftains, representing different factions, all agreeing that the king had gone too far. Tomorrow, Morvain declared, we will call for judgment. The council will vote on whether the king's actions were justified or whether they constitute betrayal of his sacred duty. If they judge against him, he must step down or face challenge. The assembly erupted again, some howling support, others shouting denial. Valdrin let them rage for a moment, then stood. Silence fell like snow. Tomorrow, he said, his voice cutting through the noise, you will hear the full truth. All of it. I will present evidence that the three chieftains have chosen not to share. And I will bring forward a witness who was there, who lost everything in those fires, who has no reason to defend me. His golden eyes found Thessaly across the hall. For a moment, their gazes locked. Tomorrow, Valdrin said, you will hear from Thessaly of Thornhaven, daughter of Brennus, sole survivor of the first village burned. And then you will judge whether I am a tyrant or a king who made an impossible choice. The hall fell absolutely silent. Thessaly felt every eye in the room turn toward her, seeking her out in her alcove. She stood slowly, letting them see her, letting them know she would not hide. Morvain's face twisted in fury. Grimwald's eyes narrowed in calculation. And Sereth, for just a moment, let their hood fall back enough for Thessaly to see their face. She would not have recognized them, except for the eyes. One green, one gold, neither quite human nor quite wolf. Sarah smiled at her, a cold expression that promised violence. The second day of the gathering adjourned in chaos. And Thessaly knew that tomorrow, she would either save a kingdom or sign her own death warrant. Perhaps both. Thessaly didn't sleep that night. She returned to her quarters under guard, Elira herself escorting her rather than trusting the task to subordinates. The palace felt different now, charged with tension. Servants hurried through corridors with heads down, avoiding eye contact. Warriors checked their weapons openly. Everyone knew that tomorrow would determine the kingdom's future. "You should eat something," Elira said, gesturing to the tray of food she'd had brought to Thessaly's room. Bread, cheese, cold meat. Simple fare, but more than Thessaly could stomach. "I'm not hungry," Thessaly said. "Fear kills appetite," Elira observed. "But you'll need your strength tomorrow. The 3 chieftains won't make this easy." "I know." Thessaly forced herself to take a piece of bread, chewing mechanically. It tasted like ash in her mouth. Elira settled into the room's single chair, making it clear she had no intention of leaving. "I'll stay tonight. Extra protection." "You think they'll try something?" "I think 3 chieftains just had their carefully planned accusations threatened by a single Omega," Elira said bluntly. "Yes, I think they'll try something." The night crept by with agonizing slowness. Thessaly lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, going over what she would say. She'd practiced with Torin and Valdrin, rehearsed the testimony until the words felt wooden in her mouth. But tomorrow, in front of 1,000 watching eyes, would she be able to speak the truth that would damn her father's memory while saving countless lives? Around midnight, she heard sounds in the corridor. Footsteps, too many for a single person. Elira was on her feet instantly, hand on her sword hilt. The footsteps passed by without stopping, but the captain remained tense. "How long have you served the king?" Thessaly asked quietly, needing to break the oppressive silence. Elira considered the question. 15 years. Since we were both young and stupid and thought we could change the world through force of will alone. Did you? Changed parts of it, Elira admitted. Not always for the better. But we tried. That has to count for something. Does it count for 3,416 lives? No, Elira said. Nothing counts for that except preventing 3,417. And 18. And so on. You don't balance the scales by dying of guilt. You balance them by making sure the next impossible choice costs fewer lives. Thessaly rolled onto her side to look at the captain. Do you ever wonder if we're lying to ourselves? Justifying terrible things by telling ourselves they're necessary? Every day, Elira said. That's how you know you're still human, even when you're wearing a wolf's face. The moment you stop questioning is the moment you become the monster people fear. Dawn came eventually, gray and cold. Thessaly dressed with care, the same simple gray dress, the same practical braids. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw not the girl who'd arrived 3 years ago burning with hate, but someone harder. Someone who'd learned that righteousness and truth weren't always the same thing. The walk to the gathering hall felt like a journey to execution. Warriors lined the corridors, more than usual, hands on weapons. Thessaly understood. If the gathering went badly, if violence erupted, the palace itself could become a battlefield. The hall was already full when she arrived, the crowd even larger than the previous day. Word had spread about the mysterious witness from the burned village. Everyone wanted to see what she would say. Valdrin was already on his throne, looking as if he hadn't slept either. His eyes met hers briefly, a moment of connection across the vast hall, and Thessaly saw in them not the monster from her nightmares but a man carrying ghosts heavier than her own. She took her place in the witness alcove. Waited. The horn sounded. The third day of the gathering began. Torrent stepped forward to address the assembly. As the king's advisor, it was his role to present the defense against the accusations. Honored chieftains, esteemed council, representatives of all territories, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the stone hall. Yesterday, you heard accusations against King Valdrin. Accusations of tyranny, of unnecessary violence, of betrayal of his sacred duty to protect all lives within his realm. He paused, letting the words settle. Today, you will hear the evidence those accusations deliberately omitted. You will learn why those villages burned. You will understand the choice the king faced. And you will hear from someone who has every reason to hate him, who lost everything in those fires, yet who has chosen to speak truth over vengeance. Torrent gestured, and servants brought forward a table. On it, they placed the documents Thessaly had spent days reading. Scout reports, medical analyses, maps showing disease spread, letters from healers. 3 years ago, Torrent said, a merchant caravan from across the eastern sea arrived in the southern territories. They brought trade goods, spices, cloth. They also brought plague. He held up the first scout report, from Corin, dated months before the burnings. This is the first documented case. Livestock dead within days. Unusual symptoms. The village healer unable to diagnose or treat the illness. He placed it down and picked up another. 2 weeks later. 3 human deaths. The village elder refuses assistance from capital healers. Claims his people can handle their own affairs. One by one, Torrent presented the evidence. The spread of disease through 12 villages. The attempts at evacuation, all refused. The council meetings where options were discussed. The evidence from the eastern kingdoms, where the same plague had killed tens of thousands when left unchecked. The hall grew quieter as he spoke. Thessaly watched the faces of the assembled chieftains. Some looked shocked. Others skeptical. But doubt was creeping in, she could see it. The certainty from yesterday was cracking. The king faced an impossible choice, Torrent said. Allow the plague to spread and risk losing the entire southern territory, perhaps the capital itself. Or act decisively, sacrificing 12 villages to save countless others. He chose to act. And he has carried the weight of that choice every day since. Convenient, Morvain said, standing. Papers can be forged. Reports fabricated. Where are the bodies? Where is the physical evidence of this plague? Burned, Torrent said simply. As was necessary to prevent spread. The disease was transmitted through contact with infected remains. Leaving bodies unburned would have seeded the plague for future outbreaks. So we have only the king's word, Grimwald said smoothly. And documents prepared by his own people. No, Valdrin said, speaking for the first time. You have the word of someone who lost everything. Who came to this palace with murder in her heart. Who planned for 3 years to kill me for what I did. He stood, and his gaze found Thessaly again. You have the word of Thessaly of Thornhaven. And I will abide by whatever she says. The weight of 1,000 eyes fell on her. Thessaly stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness platform at the center of the hall. The stone floor felt cold through her shoes. The air tasted of smoke and tension. Torrent stepped aside, giving her the floor. Thessaly looked out at the assembled chieftains, at the warriors and merchants and leaders who would judge not just Valdrin's actions but her own truthfulness. She found Ianthe in the crowd, the other Omega giving her an encouraging nod. She took a breath and began. My name is Thessaly, daughter of Brennus, headman of Thornhaven. 3 years ago, I was 9 years old. I watched from a hiding place as wolves burned my village. I watched my father die trying to protect his people. I watched my home, my entire world, turn to ash in a single night. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. I survived because my mother hid me. But she didn't survive. No one did except me. And I spent 3 years hating the king for what he took from me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Morvain looked triumphant. I came to this palace to kill him, Thessaly continued, and the murmurs grew louder. I worked my way into service in his tower. I learned the palace routines. I found where he kept his sealed orders. I planned to steal them, to expose him as a tyrant, to watch his empire crumble. She paused, meeting Valdrin's eyes across the hall. And then he showed me the truth. She gestured to the documents on the table. I've read every report. Every scout observation. Every medical analysis. Every letter from families begging for help. I've read my father's responses, refusing evacuation, refusing assistance, insisting that Thornhaven could handle its own affairs. Her voice grew stronger. My father was a good man. A proud man. But his pride killed people. The disease was real. It was spreading. And he refused to accept help until it was too late. Lies. Morvain shouted. The Omega is under the king's influence. This testimony means nothing. Then explain this, Thessaly said, her anger flaring. She pulled a folded paper from her dress, one she'd kept separate from the official documents. This is a letter my father wrote to the capital, 2 weeks before the burning. I found it in the archives. Do you want to know what it says? She unfolded it with trembling hands and read aloud. To the Wolf King's Council, your scouts are not welcome in Thornhaven. We do not need your healers or your interference. What happens in our village is our concern alone. We will handle this illness our way. Do not send aid we have not requested. The hall was absolutely silent. That's my father's handwriting, Thessaly said, her voice breaking again. His seal. His pride. And it killed 70 people before the king's wolves arrived. 70 people died of plague in Thornhaven alone before the village burned. She looked at Morvain, at Grimwald, at Sereth. The king made a terrible choice. But my father made one too. And I've had to accept that both of them, in their own ways, were trying to protect the people they were responsible for. My father failed. The king succeeded. And 3,416 people died so that 20,000 could live. 3,416, she repeated. That's the number the king carries. Every single person who burned. He knows their names. All of them. He wrote them in a journal until his hand bled. Can any of you say the same? Can you name the people you're using for your political games? Her question hung in the air like a challenge. Grimwald recovered first. Grief is understandable, he said in his smoothest voice. But it doesn't change the fact that the king ordered the burning of his own people. There must have been another way. Tell me, Thessaly said. What would you have done? The plague killed within days. It spread through contact. Leaving infected people alive meant spreading death. Evacuation was refused. Quarantine failed. What other way was there? Grimwald opened his mouth, then closed it. You were on the council when this decision was made, Thessaly said, pulling another document from the table. I found the records. You voted to take no action. To let the disease run its course. Because acting would cost you money, would disrupt your precious grain trade. She turned to Morvain. And you? You lost warriors in the southern territories. Not to the king's orders, but to your own negligence. They were there illegally, poaching on protected land. When the burning order came, they refused to evacuate. They fought the king's wolves and died for it. But you've turned them into martyrs instead of admitting they were criminals. Morvain's face purpled with rage, but Thessaly was already turning to Sereth. And you, she said to the Shadow Walker. You lost smuggling operations when those villages burned. Drug trade, weapon running, slave markets. The reports are all here. You weren't trying to save innocent people. You were trying to protect your profits. Sereth's mismatched eyes narrowed. Careful, little Omega, they said softly. You're making powerful enemies. I already had powerful enemies, Thessaly said. I've received 3 death threats in the last 2 days. All unsigned. All warning me to stay silent. I burned them all. She looked out at the assembly. The 3 chieftains who brought accusations aren't trying to expose tyranny. They're trying to remove a king who threatens their power. Who closed their illegal operations. Who demanded they follow the same laws as everyone else. This is slander. Morvain roared. This is truth, Thessaly shot back. And here's the hardest truth of all. The king was right. He made the only choice that could save the majority. And I hate that he was right. I hate that my father's stubbornness contributed to the tragedy. I hate that there was no good answer. Her voice dropped, became quieter but somehow more powerful. But I hate the idea of more children watching their families die even more. If you 3 succeed in removing the king, if you fracture this kingdom, the violence that follows will make the village burnings look like mercy. Civil war doesn't kill 3,000. It kills tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. She met the eyes of chieftains throughout the hall, making sure they heard her. So yes, I came to the palace to kill the king. But I'm standing here today asking you to support him. Not because he's perfect. Not because what he did wasn't terrible. But because he's willing to carry the weight of impossible choices. Because he remembers the names. Because he will do what's necessary to protect the most lives, even when it costs him everything. Thessaly stepped down from the platform, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. The hall was silent. She'd said everything she came to say, laid bare her pain and her truth. Now it was in their hands. Valdrin stood. The council will deliberate, he said. And tomorrow, they will vote. Whether I keep my crown or lose it, whether I live or die, at least the truth has been spoken. For that, Thessaly of Thornhaven, you have my eternal gratitude. The horn sounded, marking the end of proceedings for the day. But as Thessaly left the hall under Alira's protection, she caught Sereth's expression. The Shadow Walker was smiling, and it was not a pleasant sight. The truth had been spoken. But Thessaly had a terrible feeling that the hardest test was still to come. The attack came at midnight. Thessaly was in her quarters, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, when she heard the sounds of combat. Steel on steel. Howls of pain and rage. The palace was under assault. Alira burst through the door, sword already drawn, blood on her armor. Get up. We need to move. Now. What's happening? Sereth, Alira said grimly. They brought mercenaries. Hidden among their delegation. 50 warriors, maybe more, all striking at once. They're targeting the king's chambers and anyone who testified against them. Meaning Thessaly was a target. The captain pulled her into the corridor. Other Omegas were huddled in doorways, terrified by the sounds of battle. Illyra directed them toward the servants' passages, the hidden routes that would take them to safety. But for Thessaly, running meant leaving Baldrin to face this attack alone. "Where's the king?" she asked. "In his chambers. Surrounded. I have warriors trying to reach him, but Sereth planned this well. They'd blocked the main approaches." "The servants' passages," Thessaly said suddenly. "They connect to the king's tower. I can get there." "Absolutely not," Illyra said. "My orders are to get you to safety." "And if the king dies?" Thessaly demanded. "If Sereth succeeds?" "Everything we tried to prevent, all the truth we spoke, it means nothing if Baldrin falls tonight." Illyra hesitated, and in that moment, Thessaly made her choice. She pulled away and ran, not toward safety but deeper into the palace, toward the servants' passages she'd spent 3 years learning. "Thessaly!" Illyra shouted, but didn't follow. The captain had other duties, other people to protect. Thessaly ran through the narrow corridors, her heart hammering. She could hear fighting echoing through the walls. Screams. The sound of stone breaking. The palace was tearing itself apart. She reached the passage that led to the king's tower and found it blocked by rubble. Someone had collapsed the route deliberately. But Thessaly had learned other ways, backup passages most people didn't know existed. She doubled back, took a side corridor that led through the old kitchens, emerged into a stairwell that spiraled up the tower's interior. And there, she encountered her first enemy. A mercenary, human, armed with a short blade and murder in his eyes. He saw her and smiled. "Well, well. The little Omega who spoke so bravely. Sereth wants you alive, but dead works too." Thessaly had no weapons. She'd never trained in combat. But 3 years of planning murder had taught her something about improvisation. As the mercenary lunged, she grabbed a hanging torch from the wall and thrust it at his face. He screamed, stumbling back. Thessaly ran past him, up the stairs, her lungs burning. Behind her, she could hear him recovering, pursuing. The stairs seemed endless. The sounds of combat grew louder. She was getting closer to the king's chambers, but so were his enemies. She burst out onto the landing to find chaos. Baldrin's guards were locked in desperate battle with mercenaries, outnumbered but fighting with the ferocity of wolves protecting their alpha. Bodies littered the floor, both friend and foe. And there, fighting near the door to his chambers, was Baldrin himself. He'd transformed partially, his human form elongated and wolf-like, claws and fangs manifesting even as he kept his human intelligence. He moved like death made flesh, his great sword singing as it cut through enemies. But there were too many. Even as he killed one, 2 more took their place. Thessaly saw Sereth then, standing back from the fighting, directing the assault with hand signals. The Shadow Walker saw her at the same moment. "Kill her," Sereth commanded, and 3 mercenaries broke from the main battle, coming for Thessaly. She had nowhere to run. The stairs behind her. The battle in front. She was trapped. And then something changed inside her. Later, Thessaly would struggle to explain what happened. Omegas were supposed to be weak, submissive, powerless. But in that moment, facing death, she felt something awaken. Not strength in the traditional sense. But something else. A pull, like invisible threads connecting her to every wolf in the corridor. The mercenaries froze mid-charge, their faces going blank. Baldrin faltered in his fighting, his golden eyes swinging to her with shock. Even Sereth took a step back, genuine surprise crossing their features. Thessaly could feel it now, this power she'd never known she possessed. Omega influence. The ability to calm, to pacify, to reach into the instincts of wolves and humans alike and quiet the violence. It was said to be rare, manifesting only in moments of extreme danger, when an Omega survival instinct overrode everything else. "Stop," she said, and her voice carried a weight it had never held before. The mercenaries attacking her dropped their weapons. The battle in the corridor slowed, then stopped, as every wolf and human turned toward her, caught in the inexplicable compulsion to cease fighting. "Stand down," Thessaly commanded, and she watched in amazement as bodies obeyed. Weapons lowered. The killing stopped. Only Sereth seemed partially resistant, fighting against the influence through sheer force of will. "Impossible," the Shadow Walker hissed. "You're Omega. You have no power." "Apparently I do," Thessaly said, though she had no idea how long she could maintain this. Already she could feel the strain, like holding a massive weight that wanted to crush her. "Call off your mercenaries. This ends now." Seretha's mismatched eyes blazed with fury. "This ends when the king is dead and my operations are restored. Do you know how much I've lost because of his righteous reforms? How many profitable ventures he's destroyed?" "I don't care," Thessaly said flatly. "You're using people's grief as an excuse for your greed. The village burnings were tragedy enough without you turning them into another weapon." "Naive child," Sereth spat. "You think truth matters? You think your testimony changes anything? Power is what matters. And soon I'll have it." The Shadow Walker moved faster than Thessaly could track, drawing a blade and hurling it not at her but at Baldrin. The king was still caught in Thessaly's influence, unable to dodge. Time seemed to slow. Thessaly saw the blade spinning through the air, saw Baldrin's eyes widen in realization, saw the trajectory that would end in his heart. She released her hold on the others and threw herself forward. The blade took her in the shoulder instead of Baldrin's chest. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and all-consuming. She fell, and the world tilted sideways. The spell broke. Everyone snapped back to awareness simultaneously. Baldrin's roar shook the corridor. He transformed fully, becoming the massive silver wolf from Thessaly's nightmares, but this time she felt no fear. He was between her and Sereth in an instant, all fury and protective rage. Sereth tried to run, but Alira had arrived with reinforcements. The Shadow Walker was surrounded, trapped by guards and Baldrin's massive form. "Yield," the king commanded, his voice rough with the wolf's growl. For a moment, Thessaly thought Sereth would fight, would force them to kill. But the Shadow Walker was nothing if not practical. Slowly, they raised their hands in surrender. "Take them to the dungeons," Baldrin ordered, already transforming back to human form. He dropped to his knees beside Thessaly, his hands hovering over her wound, afraid to touch it. "Why did you do that?" "Because you're worth saving," Thessaly gasped through the pain. "Because the kingdom needs you. Because I'm tired of watching people die." "You're bleeding," Baldrin said unnecessarily, his composure cracking. "Alira. Get healers. Now." "Already coming, my lord," Alira said, and indeed Thessaly could hear footsteps rushing up the stairs. Baldrin pulled off his cloak and pressed it against her wound, trying to slow the bleeding. His hands were steady, but his eyes were wild with fear. "You saved my life." Returning the favor, Thessaly said, her voice weak. You saved 20,000. I saved 1. Hardly equivalent. It is to me, Baldrin said fiercely. The healers arrived, pushing the king aside despite his protests. Thessaly felt hands on her, felt the blade being removed, felt the blessed coolness of healing poultices. Someone gave her something to drink that tasted bitter but made the pain recede to a dull throb. She'll live, the head healer announced. But she needs rest. Weeks of it. She'll have it, Baldrin said. And whatever else she needs. Anything. Through the fog of pain and medicine, Thessaly managed a weak smile. Just stop the war. That's all I need. Consider it done, Baldrin said. They moved her to a chamber near the king's own, a room with soft furs and a fireplace that cast warm light across stone walls. Thessaly drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices discussing the aftermath of the attack. Saratha's mercenaries had surrendered once their employer was captured. The attack had been swift but brutal. 15 palace guards dead, twice that many wounded. But it could have been so much worse. Morvain and Grimwald had both been found in their quarters, uninvolved in the attack. Sarath had acted alone, gambling that with the king dead and Thessaly silenced, the other 2 chieftains would have no choice but to support their power play. It hadn't worked. And now all 3 faced judgment. The next day, Thessaly was well enough to be propped up on cushions, though the healers insisted she remain in bed. Baldrin came to visit, bringing news. The council voted this morning, he said, settling into a chair beside her bed. Unanimously in my favor. Your testimony, combined with Saratha's attack, made the decision clear. What about Morvain and Grimwald? Stripped of their chieftain status, Baldrin said. Exiled from the capital for 3 years. They weren't involved in the attack, but they knowingly brought false accusations. That has consequences. And Sarath? Baldrin's expression hardened. Execution. By their own laws, they led an assassination attempt against a reigning monarch. The sentence is clear. Thessaly felt conflicted. She'd spent 3 years wanting Baldrin dead. Now she'd taken a blade to save him, and someone else would die for trying to accomplish what she'd once planned. I saw what you did, Baldrin said quietly. The Omega influence. I've only heard of it in old stories. I didn't know I could do that, Thessaly admitted. I've never felt anything like it before. It manifests under extreme stress, when an Omega needs to stop violence to survive, Baldrin explained. It's incredibly rare. Most Omegas live their whole lives without discovering the ability. Is that why you're being so nice to me now? Thessaly asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Because I'm suddenly useful? No, Baldrin said firmly. I'm grateful because you chose to save me when you had every reason to let me die. Because you stood in front of 1,000 people and told a truth that hurt you to speak. Because you're brave and honest and far stronger than you believe. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. And because over these past weeks, working with you, talking with you, I've come to care what happens to you. Not as a king to a subject. As someone who recognizes a kindred spirit. Thessaly's breath caught. She'd felt it too, that pull between them, that understanding of shared grief and impossible choices. But she'd told herself it was nothing, that the gap between Omega Servant and Alpha King was too vast to bridge. You barely know me, she said weakly. I know you came to my palace planning murder and left planning peace, Baldrin said. I know you're willing to challenge your own beliefs when faced with truth. I know you value lives over pride. That's more than I know about most people I've spent years with. I still haven't forgiven you, Thessaly said. For my village. For my family. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Baldrin said. I'm asking if, perhaps, we might move forward together. Both carrying our ghosts, but not carrying them alone. Before Thessaly could respond, Ianthe appeared in the doorway with a tray of food. She took one look at the scene, at the king sitting by Thessaly's bedside with entirely too much emotion in his eyes, and smiled knowingly. I'll just leave this here, she said, setting down the tray. You should eat, Thessaly. Healing requires strength. After she left, Thessaly picked at the food, thinking. Everything in her life had changed so quickly. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an invisible Omega planning revenge. Now she'd testified before a gathering, survived an assassination attempt, discovered a power she didn't know she had, and apparently caught the attention of the Wolf King himself. I need time, she finally said. Time to heal. Time to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by hate or grief. Time to decide what I want my life to be. That's fair, Baldrin said, standing. Take all the time you need. The kingdom will still be here. And so will I. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Thessaly of Thornhaven, I think you're exactly who you're meant to be. Someone brave enough to change her mind. Strong enough to speak difficult truths. Powerful enough to stop wars. The kingdom could use more people like you. After he left, Thessaly lay back against the cushions, her mind whirling. Through the window, she could see the palace courtyards where life continued. Children played. Servants went about their duties. Warriors trained. The ordinary rhythm of existence that she'd helped preserve. 3,416 people had died so these moments could continue. So children could play without fear. So the old could rest knowing tomorrow would come. It was a terrible arithmetic, weighing life against life. But it was the arithmetic of survival in a complicated world where sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. Thessaly closed her eyes and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't built on hate. A future where she might find purpose beyond revenge. Where she might even find something resembling peace. It wouldn't be easy. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But time, at least, was something she finally had. Spring came slowly to the capital that year. Thessaly spent the weeks of her recovery reading, thinking, and slowly relearning how to exist without the weight of vengeance driving her every action. The wound in her shoulder healed, leaving a scar she traced sometimes in the mirror, a reminder of the night she'd chosen to save rather than destroy. Visitors came. Ianthe, daily, bringing news and gossip from the palace. Torin, with books on history and governance, suggesting she might have a mind for strategy. Alira, teaching her basic self-defense because, as the captain bluntly stated, you have a talent for getting into dangerous situations. And Baldrin, though less frequently than the others. He seemed to understand she needed space, time to sort through her feelings about him, about everything that had happened. When he did visit, they talked about small things. The weather. The progress of spring planting. The way ice melted differently depending on whether it faced sunrise or sunset. They didn't talk about the gathering, or the attack, or what he'd said about moving forward together. Those conversations waited, patient as seeds beneath snow. On the first day of true spring, when the last of the ice had melted and the first green shoots appeared in the palace gardens, Thessaly was finally cleared by the healers to leave her chamber. She dressed carefully, still favoring her healing shoulder, and made her way through the palace. Much had changed in the months since the gathering. New guards had been recruited to replace those lost in Saratha's attack. The southern territories had been reorganized, with new leadership less focused on autonomy and more on cooperation. Trade routes had reopened. Life was returning to normal, or at least to a new kind of normal. Thessaly found herself walking to the great hall, empty now of the 1,000 voices that had filled it during the gathering. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor. She stood where she'd given her testimony and remembered the fear, the determination, the strange power that had awakened in her. "I wondered if you'd come here," Baldrin's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him in the doorway, dressed simply in working clothes, looking more like a man than a king. "It feels different when it's empty," she said. "Everything does," Baldrin agreed, moving to stand beside her. "The weight of eyes and judgment is heavy. Their absence is lighter, but sometimes I miss it. At least then I knew where I stood." "And now?" Thessaly asked. "Now I'm rebuilding," Baldrin said. "Trust. Systems. Relationships. It's slower work than breaking things, but it lasts longer." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Baldrin spoke again. "I have something to show you. If you're well enough for a journey." "How long a journey?" 2 days' ride," he said. "To the southern territories." Thessaly's breath caught. She hadn't been back since the burning, hadn't thought she could face what remained. "Why?" "Because there's something you need to see," Baldrin said gently. "Something I've been working on. But only if you're ready." She thought about it. About whether she was ready to face the ghosts that lived in those ash fields. About whether she would ever be ready if she kept waiting. "All right," she said. "Show me." They left the next morning, a small party of 6. Baldrin, Thessaly, Alira, 2 guards, and a packhorse loaded with supplies. They traveled through territories awakening from winter, through villages where people greeted their king with respect if not quite warmth. The southern burnings had left scars on more than just the survivors. On the second evening, they crested a hill, and Thessaly saw what remained of Thornhaven. Or rather, what was being built where Thornhaven once stood. The ash fields were still visible, dark patches on the earth like old bruises. But among them, new structures were rising. A village, smaller than the original but carefully planned. Houses with good foundations. A central square with a well already dug. Fields marked out for spring planting. And people. Survivors from other villages, refugees who'd been displaced by the burnings, given land and supplies to start again. "We can't bring back what was lost," Baldrin said quietly as they rode down the hill. "But we can build something new. I've been working on this since the gathering ended. 12 new villages, one for each that burned. Places for survivors and refugees to rebuild their lives." Thessaly felt tears on her cheeks. She wasn't sure if they were grief or gratitude or some combination of both. "Who lives here now?" 30 families so far," Baldrin said. "More will come as word spreads. And I thought, if you wanted, you might help name it. Give it an identity that honors what was lost while looking toward what can be built." They rode into the village center, and people came out to greet their king. Thessaly saw hope in their faces, the cautious optimism of people who'd lost everything and been given a chance to start again. An old woman approached, her face weathered by years and grief. She looked at Thessaly with sharp eyes. "You're the Omega who spoke at the gathering. Word reached us even out here." "I am," Thessaly confirmed. "My son died in the burnings," the woman said. "Oakmere village. He was stubborn, like his father before him. Wouldn't evacuate when the king's wolves came. Thought he could fight the plague with prayer and herbs. Thessaly braced herself for accusation, for blame. But the old woman surprised her. "Thank you," she said simply. "For telling the truth. For helping us understand why. It doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it hurt different. And that's something." The woman turned to Valdrin. "My Lord King, I speak for the families here. We know what you did and why you did it. We know the choice you faced. And we want you to know that we're trying to forgive, even if we can't forget." Valdrin's composure cracked slightly. He bowed to the old woman, a gesture of respect from a king to a subject that clearly moved everyone watching. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." That night, they camped in the new village center. The families brought out food to share, simple fare but given generously. They told stories of those who'd been lost, keeping the memories alive. And Thessaly realized that this was how healing happened. Not by forgetting or forgiving, but by acknowledging grief while choosing to continue living anyway. Later, after the fires had burned low and most people had retired, Thessaly found herself sitting by the embers with Valdrin. Above them, stars filled the sky with more brightness than she remembered from her childhood. Out here, away from the capital's lights, the heavens felt close enough to touch. "I've made a decision," she said into the comfortable silence. Valdrin waited, patient. "I want to work with the rebuilding," Thessaly continued. "Not just here, but in all 12 villages. I want to help the survivors, help them heal, help them build something new. I have the Omega influence. Maybe I can use it for something good. To ease grief. To calm conflicts. To help people find peace." "That's a worthy goal," Valdrin said. "But it's also a heavy burden." "Are you sure you want to take it on?" "No," Thessaly admitted. "But I'm sure I want to try. I spent 3 years carrying hate. I'd like to spend the next 3 carrying hope instead. See how it compares." Valdrin smiled, genuine warmth in his golden eyes. "Then you'll have all the resources and support the crown can provide. And you'll have my personal guarantee of protection. No one will harm you while you do this work." "What about your offer?" Thessaly asked, her heart beating faster. "About moving forward together?" "It stands," Valdrin said. "But there's no pressure. If all you want from me is support for your work, you'll have it freely. If you want more, if you decide that maybe an Omega servant and an Alpha King might find common ground, then I'm here. But the choice is entirely yours." Thessaly looked at him, really looked. She saw the scars he carried, visible and invisible. Saw the loneliness of someone who'd made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Saw the hope in his eyes that she might choose him, but also the acceptance that she might not. "I can't promise you love," she said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. The gap between us is wide, and I'm still finding my footing." "I'm not asking for promises," Valdrin said. "Just possibility. Just the chance to see if maybe, while we're both carrying our ghosts, we might walk the same path for a while." "I think I can give you that," Thessaly said. "Possibility. Let's start there and see where it leads." Valdrin smiled, and it transformed his face from the stern king to someone younger, lighter, happier. "Then possibility is where we'll begin." They sat together under the stars, 2 people marked by grief but choosing to reach for something better. Around them, the new village slept, dreaming of futures not yet written. In the distance, the ash fields lay quiet, memorials to what had been lost but no longer the whole story. Thessaly thought about her father, about her mother, about her village. She thought about the 3,000, 416 names in Baldrin's journal, each one a life that deserved to be remembered. And she thought about tomorrow, when she would wake and begin the work of healing. Not just herself, but others like her. People who'd lost everything and needed to believe that something could still be built from the ashes. "Tell me something," she said to Baldrin. "Something true about yourself that has nothing to do with being king." He thought about it for a moment. "I'm afraid of deep water," he admitted. "I nearly drowned as a child, and I've never quite gotten over it. It's impractical for someone who rules coastal territories, but there it is." Thessaly laughed, surprised by the honesty and the mundane nature of the confession. "The great wolf king, afraid of water?" "Terrified," Baldrin confirmed, smiling. "Your turn. Tell me something true." "I sing when I'm nervous," Thessaly said. "Old songs my mother taught me. I can't carry a tune at all, but it helps. The other Omegas used to laugh at me for it." "Sing something now," Baldrin requested. "I'm not nervous," Thessaly pointed out. "Then sing something anyway," he said. "Not because you're afraid, but because you want to." So Thessaly sang, her voice soft and imperfect, an old lullaby about stars and seeds and a promise of spring. Baldrin listened, and in his eyes, she saw not judgment but appreciation for the simple act of sharing something personal. When she finished, he said, "That was beautiful." "You're a terrible liar," Thessaly said, but she was smiling. "No," Baldrin said seriously. "It was beautiful because it was honest. Because you trusted me enough to share something imperfect. That's worth more than all the perfect performances in the world." They talked late into the night, sharing small truths and comfortable silences. And when Thessaly finally retired to her tent, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but real enough to matter. The next morning, they began the ride back to the capital. But Thessaly knew she would return to the Southern Territory soon. There was work to be done, lives to help rebuild, wounds to help heal. She'd come to the palace to burn an empire. Instead, she'd helped save it. And in doing so, she'd discovered that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't choosing between right and wrong, but between different kinds of wrong, and finding the courage to live with the choice. As they crested the final hill before the capital came into view, Baldrin rode up beside her. "No regrets?" he asked. Thessaly considered the question. She thought of her father, her village, the hate she'd carried like armor for 3 years. Thought of the testimony, the blade in her shoulder, the slow unfurling of something like hope in her chest. "Regrets, yes," she said honestly. "But also gratitude. For the chance to choose truth over vengeance. For the possibility of building instead of burning. For whatever comes next." "For whatever comes next," Baldrin echoed, and in his smile, Thessaly saw a reflection of her own cautious optimism. The capital spread before them, stone and timber and the promise of 10,000 ordinary lives continuing. Somewhere in those streets, in those buildings, children were playing. Elders were resting. People were laughing and fighting and loving and dreaming. All of it possible because impossible choices had been made. Because sometimes the only way to save the many was to sacrifice the few. Because leaders and Omegas and everyone in between occasionally had to carry weights too heavy for one person, and the only way to survive was to share the burden. Thessaly of Thornhaven had learned these lessons in blood and ash and terrible arithmetic. But she'd also learned that endings could be beginnings. That hate could transform into something better. That the girl who'd watched her world burn could choose to plant seeds in the ashes. And as they rode toward the capital, toward a future uncertain but no longer defined solely by grief, Thessaly allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, those seeds would grow into something worth planting. The empire hadn't burned. And in choosing to save it, Thessaly had saved herself. That was enough. For now, it was enough. Sometimes, the hardest choice is not between good and evil, but between two different kinds of grief. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to build rather than burn, to heal rather than hate, to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. The Omega didn't come to the palace to be a mate. She came to burn an empire. But in learning the truth behind the ashes, she discovered that some fires destroy what should stand, and that the greatest power isn't in burning, but in choosing when to stop.